Nations. The 24th of October marks 80 years since the United Nations as an entity came into being, born out of the ashes of World War II to uphold peace, equality and collective security. 8 decades on, however, the organization that once symbolized global unity, a sense of working in singular purpose towards a specific goal, is now facing one of its gravest challenges, a looming financial crisis. As its funding tends to dry up and divisions deepen, the question still lingers: can the UN survive this crisis? Well, the United Nations Secretary General, António Guterres, has stressed his determination for the UN to become a lot more efficient and cost-effective. But he says getting there depends on member states fulfilling their commitments on time. Here's CGTN's Beryl Oro with more.
The United Nations Secretary General last week presented his proposed program budget for 2026 to the General Assembly's fifth committees, saying that despite earlier hopes, the downward trend of collections has continued.
The budget before you today and the meaningful reductions in the revised estimate report reaffirm our determination to become ever more efficient and cost-effective. Looking ahead, work streams 2 and 3 of the UN80 initiative are also underway. Any budgetary implications arising from these efforts will be assessed rigorously and reflected in future budget proposals for your consideration. But success also depends on member states fulfilling their commitments. Ultimately, effective delivery in 2026 will depend on the timely and full payment of assessed contributions. Despite earlier hopes, the downward trend of collections has continued.
The budget proposal brings resource requirements for 2026 down to $3.23 billion, a reduction of $577 million, or 15.1% compared with 2025, while staffing has been revised to 11,594 posts, a reduction of 2,681 posts, or 18.8% compared with 2025.
Today, in the last quarter of 2025, we still have significant uncertainty about the collections for the year. And given the present level of uncertainty about income, we could end 2025 with a deficit of more than $450 million, even after reducing the spending by nearly $600 million. This will wipe out nearly all our liquidity reserves and leave us highly vulnerable to any delays in collections next year.
The Secretary General said the organization is also required to return $300 million in credits to member states at the beginning of 2026.
My report on improving the financial situation of the United Nations, fast-tracked earlier this year for your consideration, proposes a mechanism to suspend credit returns whenever liquidity shortfalls threaten full budget implementation of the following year. The membership did not reach a decision, and the report was deferred to this session. Failure to reach an agreement on addressing the deteriorating liquidity situation could jeopardize critical elements of our program of work. So once again, I urge member states to consider these proposals carefully and to meet their financial obligations in full and on time.
The Secretary General said a failure to respond to the financial obligation means a race to bankruptcy, adding that unless arrears are substantially reduced or the return of credits is suspended, this will constrain the implementation of the program budget. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Now then, on paper, the 15% or near $600 million spending cut proposed by the United Nations for its 2026 budget is quite literally a fraction of some countries' budgets, or more accurately, line items in them. For example, it's less than 0.5% of Germany's defense budget for the next 12 months. But with the United States providing at least 20% of the United Nations funding and the Trump administration's well-documented intent to dramatically cut foreign spending, shouldn't the organization be making even deeper spending cuts? That's why I started this conversation with Christopher Vandome. He's a senior research fellow at Chatham House.
Yes, and you've also got to bear in mind that the countries that are making these contributions aren't only funding the UN, and it's not only the UN where you've seen a withdrawal of American funding. So, US AID cuts as well are playing into this, because where you've seen where those cuts have been made by the US, it's not just this one institution, it's across the board, and it means that other member countries aren't just looking at whether or not they need to step into the gap and fund American shortfalls within the UN. They're also looking at where they might have to fund American shortfalls in other areas as well, particularly in the development space. And that includes some of the UN agencies where they're not funded by that UN core budget. So organizations like UNDP, World Food Programme, across the board where there have been these cuts, other member states are being asked whether or not that they can fill in those gaps. In some cases, they will be able to, and there will be some additional pickup in those contributions, but they can't step in everywhere and they can't step in across the board.
The Secretary General is proposing a 15% cut in spending, as we just discussed, nearly $600 million. But the United States provides about 22%, right, of the UN's budget. Given that sort of number, shouldn't the UN be making deeper spending cuts and combining common services in order to get ahead, right, of that withdrawal from funding the UN and other multilateral agencies, as you've just mentioned?
Yeah, and I think that difference between the US cuts versus the budget cuts, I think, does reflect a little bit that other countries are going to step in and cover some of the costs, but clearly they're not going to step in and cover all of the costs. I think going forward, the UN kind of processing and thinking around this is going to be one of, okay, how do we do, it's either got to be one of how do we do more or as much as we are doing with less, or it's got to be a conversation of, okay, well, we're getting less already. It may be that we get even less next time round. So as you say, a deeper cuts in terms of activities to try and get ahead of those funding shortfalls. So there is that consideration to be made, and it does require more strategic thinking on the part of the UN over how it uses the resources that it has, where it actually wants to be deeply engaged, the extent to which it wants to be engaged on so many issues and in so many places, and the extent to which for certain issues on which it is engaged, how much can it put towards that and how closely can it follow those. So, yes, there are those decisions to be made. But to your point of this distinction between the extent to which we're being cut in the short term versus that American withdrawal, we can't. American withdrawal from some of these organizations cannot really it's difficult for it to be met with instant responses because there are programs in place on the ground, there are activities that are ongoing. And we've already seen, particularly across Africa, where the withdrawal of USAID funding has led to quite significant worsening of situation, particularly shortfalls in health spending, shortfalls in humanitarian assistance, a number of people who are out on the market looking for jobs. Organizations of this scale and complexity can't simply shut down, huge projects and huge elements overnight.